Hello and welcome to this sleep hypnosis recording. My name is Jason Newland. Please only listen when you can safely close your eyes. This recording is called You Are Perfect the Way You Are. You are perfect the way you are. And perhaps there's something interesting about hearing those words. You may have heard them in the past. Maybe you haven't heard them. Perhaps you've even wondered inside about whether or not that's true and what that could mean when we all know that we have faults. What does it mean that you're perfect the way you are? Because one part of you may accept them immediately, while another part may wonder. Another part may question. Another part of you may search quietly through old memories, old experiences, old opinions, old comparisons, looking for evidence. And you don't have to stop any of that. You don't have to make yourself believe anything. You don't have to convince yourself of anything. Because sometimes the deepest changes begin when you no longer have to try quite so hard to change. And wherever you are right now, whatever you can hear around you, whatever sensations you happen to notice, whatever thoughts happen to come and go, all of that can simply become part of this experience. There may be sounds nearby. There may be sounds further away. There may be thoughts that seem important for a moment and then somehow become less important. And you can notice how naturally your attention moves from these words to a thought, to a sensation, perhaps to a memory, and then back again. And you don't have to control where your attention goes. because there is another part of your mind that already knows how to become absorbed. You've done that many times before. Perhaps while listening to music, watching something interesting, looking through a window, remembering something from 5 years ago, or simply discovering that several minutes have passed without you quite noticing how they passed. And that ability to become absorbed belongs to you. You don't have to learn it. You can simply allow yourself to remember how naturally it happens. And as you continue listening, you may begin to notice something curious. The words can remain here while your conscious mind can wander wherever it needs to wander. And perhaps some other part of you can listen differently. Not trying to understand every sentence and not needing to remember everything. Because sometimes forgetting consciously allows something useful to be remembered in another way. And you may already be beginning to discover that. You are perfect the way you are. And perhaps the word perfect can mean something different now. Not flawless, not never making mistakes, not always knowing what to do, not always feeling confident, not always getting everything right. Because perhaps perfection was never supposed to mean any of those things. A tree can lose a branch and still be completely itself. The sea can be calm one day and rough another day, and nobody accuses the sea of failing to be the sea. The sky can be clear, cloudy, grey, blue, dark, bright, and every version belongs. And somewhere inside you, perhaps there is an understanding beginning to emerge. You have been allowed to expect things from yourself that you would never expect from nature. You may have learned that you should be different, better, stronger, quieter, more successful, more attractive, more confident, more productive, less emotional, less sensitive, more this, less that. And perhaps nobody has ever stopped long enough to ask, better according to who? Enough according to what? Compared with what? Because comparison has an interesting habit of changing the measuring stick whenever you get close. And you may have noticed that before. You reach one standard and another appears. You solve one supposed imperfection, and the mind discovers another, and another, until perhaps some part of you begins to understand that the problem was never you. The problem may have been the measuring. And you can stop measuring for a while. You don't even have to know how to stop, because you can become interested instead. Interested in what happens when those old measurements begin to matter less. And somewhere inside, there may be a younger version of you, not a particular age necessarily, not necessarily a particular memory, just that part that once looked outward to discover who it was supposed to be. Children do that naturally. They look at faces, they listen to voices, they notice approval, They notice disapproval. They notice when somebody smiles. They notice when somebody withdraws. And gradually meanings are formed. This is good, that is bad. This gets approval, that doesn't. I should be like this. I shouldn't be like that. And those meanings can become rules without anybody consciously deciding to make them rules. Rules about worth. Rules about belonging. Rules about being lovable. Rules about being acceptable. And rules learned long ago can sometimes continue operating long after they are needed. Like an old sign pointing toward a road that no longer exists. And you don't have to tear down every old sign. You can simply discover that you no longer have to follow it. There is a difference. And your unconscious mind can begin noticing those old signs. Perhaps over the coming days, perhaps in moments you wouldn't expect, an old self-critical thought might appear, and something else may appear with it. A little distance, some curiosity, a quiet recognition that was an old rule. It was an old rule. I want you to recognize an old rule as an old rule. It can never quite have the same unquestionable authority again, can it? That'd be impossible. Because noticing changes what is noticed. Noticing changes what is noticed. And perhaps you've spent years noticing what you thought was wrong with you. So I wonder what might happen when your mind begins automatically noticing what is already right. Noticing the things you have survived, the things you have learned, the kindness you have shown the times you have continued when continuing wasn't easy. The little things nobody applauded. The moments nobody saw. The decisions that weren't perfect and nevertheless taught you something. The mistakes that became experience. The disappointments that became understanding. The endings that eventually created beginnings you couldn't see at the time. You don't have to try and turn your entire past into something positive, because that would be ridiculous. Because some things were extremely painful. Some things were very, very unfair. Some things you might still wish, had never happened or had happened differently. So acceptance does not require pretending, and self-acceptance doesn't require pretending either. You can acknowledge every unfinished edge, every uncertainty, every contradiction, every part of yourself you're still getting to know, and somehow begin to understand. This belongs to. Perhaps you can imagine an old house, not a perfect house, a real house. A house that has existed for many years. There are marks on the walls. Perhaps a floorboard creaks. Paint has faded in places. There may have been repairs, changes, rooms decorated and redecorated, things removed, things added, and somehow every mark tells you that this house has been lived in. Nobody would look at an old home filled with history and say it should be ashamed because it doesn't look newly built. Its history is part of what makes it what it is. And you have history. You have marks left by living. Some visible only to you. Some perhaps forgotten. And those things don't reduce your value. They reveal that you've been here, living, learning, changing, adapting, becoming. And perhaps you spent enough time imagining that you have to become someone else before you can finally be comfortable with yourself. You can become comfortable first and then discover what changes naturally. That's different, because change created by rejection says, I must become different because I am unacceptable. And change created by acceptance can quietly say, I am already acceptable, and I'm curious about what I can become. Those are very different places from which to grow. A flower doesn't become more worthy when it opens. It was already completely what it needed to be when it was only a small green shoot beneath the soil. And sometimes people confuse development with worth. You can develop. You can learn. You can change. You can make different choices. You can improve skills. You can alter habits. You can discover new interests. You can become more confident. You can become calmer. You can become wiser. And none of those things need to make you more worthy. Because worth isn't something you earn by completing enough improvements. Imagine how exhausting it would be if you had to earn the right to be yourself every morning. And perhaps you've been doing some version of that without even realizing it. Proving, explaining, comparing, judging, trying to become acceptable. And maybe that job can gradually become redundant. You don't have to sack the inner critic. You don't have to fight it. Perhaps it can simply be given a different job. Because even criticism may once have been trying to accomplish something useful. Perhaps it thought criticism would keep you safe. Perhaps it thought that noticing your faults before somebody else noticed them would protect you. Perhaps it thought perfection prevented rejection. Perhaps it thought constant vigilance was necessary. So you can appreciate the intention without continuing the strategy. You can say in your own way, "Thank you," and you can rest now. And perhaps that part doesn't trust this immediately. And that's all right. It can watch. It can wait. It can notice what happens. Because nobody inside you needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be forced. And when nothing inside needs to be forced, something interesting can happen. Different parts begin communicating differently. The part that wants change and the part that fears change. The part that wants connection and the part that protects itself. The part that feels confident and the part that doubts. The part that knows and the part that wonders. They don't have to defeat one another. Perhaps they can begin to realize that they're all living in the same person, and that person is you. One whole human being containing contradictions, strength and vulnerability, certainty and uncertainty, courage and fear, joy and sadness, wisdom and confusion. And maybe wholeness was never about eliminating half of yourself. Maybe wholeness is discovering that all of you can belong, even the parts you haven't understood yet, especially those parts. And as those words settle somewhere, you may begin to remember moments when you felt completely yourself. Perhaps very ordinary moments. Maybe laughing without thinking about how you looked. Talking without rehearsing the words. Doing something you enjoyed without wondering whether you were any good at it. alone without needing to perform. Being with someone who allowed you to simply be. And if a particular memory doesn't come, that's fine. Your unconscious mind knows what is relevant, and it can search without conscious assistance. It can search through thousands upon thousands of moments, sorting, connecting, recovering forgotten experiences of being enough. Perhaps very small ones, and small things can become surprisingly important when repeated. One moment of self-kindness, then another. One moment when you catch an unnecessary criticism. One moment when you don't compare yourself. One moment when you allow yourself to enjoy something without earning it. One moment when you say what you actually think. One moment when you say no. One moment when you say yes. One moment when you realize you don't have to explain yourself. And those moments can accumulate quietly, naturally, until one day you notice something has changed, and you may not even know exactly when it happened. That's often how natural learning works. Nobody remembers the exact moment they became able to recognize every letter of the alphabet. There was simply a time when they couldn't. A period of learning, and eventually they could. And perhaps self-acceptance can develop like that. Not one enormous declaration. Not standing in front of a mirror trying to force yourself to believe something. Just repeated experiences of no longer attacking yourself. and then discovering what remains when the attack stops. Because perhaps underneath all those judgments, you were there all along. And you don't need to find yourself as though you've disappeared. Perhaps you only need to stop looking past yourself. There you are, the person listening right now, the person who has lived every single day of your life, the only person who has been present for every single private thought, every hidden fear, every quiet victory, every loss, every beginning, every strange little moment that nobody else remembers. You. Perhaps there's something profoundly important about becoming someone you can be at home with. Not because you're perfect according to some impossible standard, but because you're you. And nobody else in the world can fulfill that particular role. Nobody else has exactly your history, your perspective, your particular combination of experiences, your way of noticing things, your sense of humour, your sensitivities, your peculiarities, your preferences, your memories, your possibilities. And even the things you've disliked about yourself may contain qualities that have another side. Sensitivity can hurt, and sensitivity can understand. Caution can restrict, and caution can protect. Stubbornness can resist, and stubbornness can persist. An active mind can overthink, and an active mind can imagine. The quality isn't always the problem. Sometimes it simply needs a better direction. And your unconscious mind can begin discovering those better directions. Without needing a complete plan. Because you don't need to know exactly who you will become. You only need permission to continue becoming. And you have that permission. You can change your mind. You can outgrow old identities. You can discover that something you believed about yourself isn't true anymore. You can stop carrying descriptions other people gave you. You can decide that somebody else's inability to recognize your value never determined your value. You can stop auditioning for acceptance. You can stop asking people who don't understand you to define you. And you can become increasingly selective about which voices deserve space inside your mind. Because not every opinion deserves to become an identity. Not every criticism deserves to become a belief. Not every rejection means there was something wrong with you. Not every ending means you failed. And perhaps there are things you once interpreted personally that you can now understand differently. You were doing what you knew how to do with what you understood then. And now you know things you didn't know then. Of course, you would make some different choices now. That's what learning means. The person who looks back and sees another possibility is already different from the person who couldn't see it then. And perhaps forgiveness can begin there. Not excusing everything, not pretending consequences don't matter, simply recognizing that you are allowed to stop punishing yourself for not having today's understanding yesterday. You didn't have it yet. Now you have more. And tomorrow you may have more still. That's living. And somewhere inside you, those old neural pathways of criticism and comparison may have become familiar simply because they've been travelled so often. Familiar doesn't mean true. Familiar only means familiar. And every time you respond differently, a new possibility becomes a little easier to find again. Perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps unexpectedly several days from now, something happens that would normally trigger that old internal voice. And before the usual reaction completes itself, there may be a pause, a tiny pause, just enough space for another possibility. Maybe I don't need to speak to myself that way. Or I'm allowed to make mistakes. Or perhaps simply it's okay. And those simple moments matter, because change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly and starts rearranging things. And I wonder whether some rearranging is already happening now. Old beliefs moving slightly. Old conclusions becoming less certain. New possibilities finding somewhere to settle. You don't need to inspect the process. You can let it happen privately. And perhaps you can imagine yourself sometime in the future, not dramatically different, still you. That's important. Still recognizably you. but something has softened. There is less effort, less need to prove, less need to compare. You look at another person succeeding and you don't automatically make their success mean something about you. You see someone attractive and don't need to become less attractive by comparison. Someone knows something you don't know, and that's simply something they know. Someone doesn't like you, and somehow the world continues. Someone misunderstands you, and you may explain if it matters, or perhaps you don't. Because you know yourself a little better now. And that changes things. You begin making decisions according to what actually matters to you. You notice what feels right. You recognize what doesn't. You become kinder without becoming weaker, more accepting without becoming passive. More comfortable without giving up growth. And perhaps other people notice something. They may not know what it is, because confidence doesn't always look loud. Sometimes confidence is simply the absence of unnecessary apology. Sometimes confidence is saying, I don't know. Sometimes confidence is changing your mind. Sometimes confidence is leaving something that isn't right. Sometimes confidence is staying. Sometimes confidence is asking for help. Sometimes confidence is allowing yourself to be seen without editing every part first. And perhaps that kind of confidence can become increasingly natural. Because when you stop trying to manufacture a better version of yourself. You have more energy available to actually live. And there may be things you want to do, experiences you want to have, people you want to know, things you want to create, places you want to go. Or perhaps you simply want more peaceful, ordinary days. And ordinary days matter. You don't need an extraordinary life to justify your existence. You don't need achievements to prove that being alive was worthwhile. You don't need an audience. And you don't need constant approval. There is something deeply peaceful about discovering I am allowed to exist without performing. I am allowed to exist without performing. And perhaps some part of you has waited a very long time to hear that. You are allowed to exist without performing. You are allowed to rest without earning rest. You are allowed to enjoy things you're not particularly good at. You are allowed to have preferences other people don't understand. You are allowed to change. You're also allowed to remain the same. You are allowed to take up your own particular amount of space in this world. And you don't have to become smaller so someone else can feel bigger. You don't have to become bigger either. You can simply become more completely yourself. And perhaps that is enough. More than enough. Because the strange thing about accepting yourself is that it doesn't stop growth. It makes healthier growth possible. A gardener doesn't scream at a plant for not growing quickly enough. Conditions are created. Light, water, space, and time. And growth happens according to something already present within the living thing. You have that something too. You don't have to consciously understand it, but you can create better internal conditions. Kindness, patience, curiosity, permission, boundaries, rest, meaning, and that allows your own development to happen. Perhaps differently from anyone else's, exactly as it needs to be. And you may begin noticing over the coming days that your internal language changes. Maybe only slightly at first. The word should appears less often. The question, "What's wrong with me?" loses some of its power. And another question might quietly replace it. What do I need? Or what can I learn? Or what matters now? And those are very different questions. Different questions lead attention toward different answers. Different answers lead toward different choices. And different choices repeated become different patterns, and different patterns eventually become a different experience of being you. Without you ever having to become somebody else. Isn't that interesting? That you can change your experience of being yourself without changing who you fundamentally are. And perhaps that's the change that matters. You may even discover that some things you wanted to fix don't need fixing. Some things simply need understanding. Some need practice. Some need acceptance. Some need boundaries. Some need time. And some things can simply be left alone. your unconscious mind can sort those categories far more efficiently than you need to consciously manage. It can begin deciding this can change, this can heal, this can develop, this can be accepted, this can be released, this was never mine to carry. And you don't have to know which is which right now, because learning continues after words end. A useful idea can return hours later. A new reaction can surprise you. A dream can rearrange something. A conversation can suddenly be understood differently. An old memory can lose some of its emotional weight. And perhaps the next time you look at yourself, really look, you may see more than the collection of flaws your mind learned to search for. You may see history, character, survival, humor, possibility, humanity, and you might even begin to like the person looking back. You don't have to love every part immediately. There's no deadline. You can simply begin by refusing to be your own enemy. And when you're no longer fighting yourself, you may discover you've gained an ally who has been waiting your entire life. You. And imagine what becomes possible when you are on your own side. When mistakes happen, you're on your own side. When somebody rejects you, you are on your own side. When something succeeds, you're on your own side. When you're uncertain, you're on your own side. When you're tired, you are on your own side. When you're beginning again. You're on your own side. And when you're completely alone, you're still with someone who has learned how to treat you kindly. That changes the meaning of being alone. And perhaps there is a deep quietness in knowing that you don't have to abandon yourself anymore. Whatever happens next, you come with you. You're with yourself all the time, caring, protecting. And you can become a safe place to return to. Not perfect according to some impossible external standard. Perfect in a much deeper sense. Complete enough to be here. Worthy enough to receive kindness. Human enough to make mistakes. Strong enough to have weaknesses. Wise enough to still have things to learn. And unfinished enough to continue becoming. You are perfect the way you are, and you are allowed to change. Both can be true. You are enough and you can grow. Both can be true. You can accept yourself, you can accept your past, and choose differently tomorrow. Both can be true. You can have regrets and still respect yourself. You can have fears and still move forward. You can have difficult days and still have a meaningful life. You can sometimes doubt your worth without your worth ever actually changing. Because a cloud passing across the sun doesn't switch off the sun. And a thought passing through your mind doesn't define the person having the thought. Thoughts pass. Feelings change. Opinions change. Bodies change. Circumstances change. And somewhere beneath all those changes, there is a continuing sense of being you. And perhaps you can become curious about that. the you who has existed through every age you've ever been. Different body, different knowledge, different circumstances, and somehow you. That continuity can become a quiet place inside. A place where nothing needs proving. A place where comparison has no useful job. A place where you can simply know. I belong to myself. And perhaps those words can settle deeply. I belong to myself. My life belongs to me. My choices belong to me. My mistakes can teach me. My experiences can shape me without defining my limits. My past can inform me without controlling my future. And I can become increasingly comfortable being the person I already am. You don't need to repeat any of that consciously. The words can disappear. The meaning can remain. And sometime soon, perhaps you'll notice yourself doing something differently. Maybe you'll catch your reflection and not immediately search for a flaw. Maybe you'll make a small mistake and simply correct it. Maybe you'll hear criticism and decide whether it's useful before accepting it. Maybe you'll receive a compliment without arguing. Maybe you'll say no without producing a long explanation. Maybe you'll allow yourself to enjoy something. Maybe you'll stop comparing, even for 30 seconds. And 30 seconds can become a minute. A minute can become a habit. A habit can become a way of living. and you don't need to rush any of it, because something inside already knows the direction towards greater acceptance, greater freedom, greater kindness, greater authenticity, toward the simple understanding that you never needed to earn the right to be you.